While not nearly as discussed as the battles and the generals, both the Confederacy and the Union engaged in robust espionage programs during the Civil War. These 19th century spies engaged in cloak and dagger activities that would be worthy of a 007 movie, including a plot on November 25th, 1864, to reduce the largest city in the Union to ashes. The Confederate Secret Service had all the elements necessary for a modern spy novel: spy rings, secret codes, agents and double agents, saboteurs, a bureau inventing tools and gadgets, and numerous intrigues, plans large and small. With various supporters throughout the Union, the Confederate spy operations ranged from simple espionage to complex plots and found varying degrees of success. A bounty law passed by the Confederate Congress reimbursed private vessels who destroyed Union warships, encouraged privateering, which itself included quite a lot of intrigue. For example, in June of 1861, less than 3 months after the outbreak of the war, a Confederate officer and soldier of fortune named Richard Thomas Zarvona, the son of a former Speaker of the Maryland House of Delegates and nephew of a former governor, formulated a bold plan to use disguise and subterfuge to take control of a passenger steamer and use it to surprise and capture a federal gunboat on the Potomac River. In a daring act of piracy, the plotters managed to capture the packet steamer St. Nicholas by boarding the boat in disguise, facilitated by Zarvona, who dressed and spoke as a young Frenchwoman. They loaded a boarding party of Confederate Marines planning to surprise and board the federal sloop USS Pawnee, and the ruse may have worked, but they found out that the Pawnee had been moved to Washington and chose instead to sail up the Chesapeake Bay, where they captured 3 more Union merchant vessels before escaping to Virginia. In 1862, the bounty law was amended to reimburse any person who shall invent or construct any new machine or engine, or contrive any new method for destroying the armed vessels of the enemy. This encouraged invention, including devices of sabotage, such as the coal torpedo, an explosive disguised as coal that may have damaged as many as 60 Union vessels, and the submarine CSS Hunley. Thus, the Confederate plans included their own version of James Bond's Q. But the plans throughout the war were not always coordinated. Spies were often members of the Confederate Signal Corps, but various operations were carried out by both the Army and the Navy, as well as there being various independent groups, and covert activities were conducted by the Confederate Foreign Service. But as the war wore on and the military situation became increasingly desperate, as Confederate ire grew over destruction caused by Union troops, and in the wake of outrage regarding a failed federal plan called the Dahlgren Conspiracy that purportedly included freeing and arming Union prisoners of war to burn Richmond and assassinate Confederate President Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy finally appropriated the significant sum of $1 million to fund a special branch of the Confederate military, the Confederate Secret Service, and many of the most audacious plans of that organization were made in Canada. Despite an official position of neutrality, and despite the thorny issue of slavery, much of the British sympathy in the Civil War was for the Confederacy. There were many reasons for this sympathy. Commercial interest in the empire, where textiles were a major source of trade, favored the importation of cotton, and British industrialists saw the factories of the North as an economic competitor. Many throughout the empire felt that the Confederacy's bid for independence was the moral equivalent of the American Revolution, and that it was hypocritical for the Union to fight it. Some Englishmen found a similarity in culture with the genteel aristocracy of the South, and in Canada, there was the additional and not unfounded concern that the United States represented a threat to Canadian sovereignty, and the Civil War weakened that threat. In fact, the British military had created contingency plans in case of an American attack on Canada or war with the Union. In this environment, a large community of Confederate expatriates, escaped Confederate prisoners of war, families Confederate officials sent away for their safety, refugees from Confederate lands that had been captured by the Union, lived across the northern border, where Confederate spies found a home. In a 2018 review of the book Montreal, City of Secrets, the website Canada's History writes, as for Canada, while it was far from the battlefields geographically, it was on the front lines when it came to the machinations that went on behind the scenes. The nexus of this activity was Montreal, which played host to Confederate spies as well as to millions of dollars in hard currency or gold, much of it used to bankroll clandestine activities against the U.S. North. The general sympathy of the Canadian authorities meant that these agents could act openly, although the city included northern spies as well. In April of 1864, President Davis sent 3 commissioners, including the former U.S. Secretary of the Interior and a former U.S. Senator, to Canada aboard the blockade runner Thistle to coordinate activities against the North. There, they helped to locate escaped Confederate prisoners of war, refugees who had fled to Canada, and facilitated their return to the Confederacy, to coordinate a clandestine peace movement with sympathetic politicians in the North, and to engage in schemes to harm the Union. One of the Confederate officers involved was John W. Headley, a lieutenant in the Kentucky 1st Cavalry Regiment, one of some 35,000 Kentuckians to serve for the Confederacy. In 1909, Headley published an account of Confederate operations in Canada. A veteran, in the summer of 1864, he was ordered to proceed north to Canada to engage in Confederate spy operations. He later wrote, "We only knew that we would be expected to engage with other young officers in expeditions, and it was, of course, a perilous journey to Canada, as we must travel in citizens' clothes to go through the United States. Our capture meant death." He traveled with another officer to the west, traveled to St. Louis on a steamer full of Union troops, and then caught trains to Chicago, Detroit, and into Canada. Robert Cobb Kennedy was from Georgia, a distant relative of a former Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. He spent 2 years at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, but was discharged due to demerits. He enlisted with the Confederacy at the outbreak of war and served at the Battle of Shiloh. He was captured while working as a dispatch rider and imprisoned in Ohio at Johnson's Island, a camp for Confederate officers that was notoriously difficult to escape from. Nonetheless, using a makeshift ladder, he was among the few to successfully do so. He made his way to Canada, where he was recruited into the schemes of the Confederate Secret Service. Among the boldest of these schemes was the Camp Douglas conspiracy. The plan was to liberate the Confederate prisoners of war, initially those held at Camp Douglas near Chicago, arm them, and attack the Union from within. The plan would initially be carried out by Confederates who had been recruited in Canada by arming sympathetic Northern Copperheads. Once freeing an army of some 25,000 men in Illinois, the force was to capture the Union governments in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The plot was bold to the point of harebrained, but given the military situation, the Confederates were willing to take the risk. The American Civil War Society notes that currently many historians are still arguing over whether the plot was actually real, feasible, or perhaps an elaborate hoax, which was unduly exaggerated and exploited so that certain federal officers would benefit. But undoubtedly there were Confederate agents working on the conspiracy. Their efforts, however, were uncovered, and an entire federal regiment and battery of artillery was sent to reinforce Camp Douglas. Support ended up being meager, and far too few volunteers were found to challenge the reinforced garrison. But the plot was not abandoned, just delayed. It's possible that the goal of creating the so-called Northwest Confederacy was a reach. In 1864, Lincoln was locked in a contentious campaign with the Democratic candidacy of George McClellan. The former general was running on a platform of ending the war by promising to protect slavery. The goal might have been simply to cause enough disruption to undermine Lincoln's re-election chances. The date for the attack was moved to the day of the election, November 8th, but this time it would include more than just Chicago. But before that could happen, another of the Confederate plans unfolded. A group of Confederate soldiers entered the United States through Canada and raided the town of St. Albans, Vermont. The goal was not just to cause disruption and distract Union troops, but also to rob banks in order to bankroll Confederate plans. Conducted October 19th, the raiders successfully robbed a bank, but were driven off as the town mounted a resistance. Under American pressure, Canadian authorities arrested the men. The money was returned, but Canadian authorities decided not to extradite the raiders. But the affair started to turn Canadian opinion against the Confederates over concern that they would drag Canada into the war. It isn't clear if the St. Albans raid emboldened the next set of plans, or if it simply made the Confederates more desperate to act quickly. The new attack plan for November 8th, the day of the election, was still to free the Confederate prisoners, but also set fire to the city of Chicago. Detachments were created tasked with setting fires, robbing banks, and flooding sections of the city. The attacks would cause widespread damage, and the distraction would give the chance to free the prisoners at Camp Douglas. But the plan went beyond Chicago, with smaller attacks planned in other cities in the north: Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Boston, and the nation's largest city, New York. Headley and Cobb were among the group of 8 sent to raise chaos on Election Day in New York City, calling themselves the Confederate Army of Manhattan. New York was a hotbed of the Copperheads, Northern Democrats who sympathized with the South, and opposition to Lincoln and his cabinet, and support for the Union was tempered by trading ties with the South. In July of 1863, the city had erupted into violence over resistance to the drafting of soldiers, and there was a possibility it could be drawn into rebellion again. Careful plans were laid. The plan was to set fires to distract city officials, occupy federal buildings, obtain weapons from arsenals, and arm a crowd of supporters. The insurgents would raise a Confederate flag over City Hall and declare that New York City had left the Union and had aligned itself with the Confederate government in Richmond. But like so many plans of Confederate Secret Service, the Union knew They were coming. In Chicago, Union men had infiltrated the militaristic Copperhead organizations, and the operation had been betrayed, including by a Confederate officer in the camp who was repulsed by the violence involved in the plan. The leaders among the sympathizers were arrested, and the plan collapsed. Elsewhere, election violence was anticipated, and federal troops were moved into cities. Officials in New York were doubtful about the warnings, but a Union force under Major General Benjamin Butler was sent to the city. Headley wrote, "The leaders in our conspiracy were at once demoralized by the sudden advent of General Butler and his troops. They felt that he must be aware of their purposes. The plan was once again called off." Headley wrote, "The feints in Boston, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati likewise were not attempted. The election went as scheduled. Union victories, including Sherman's capture of Atlanta, had taken the steam out of the opponents of the war. Lincoln won re-election easily." The danger seemed to have passed. Butler and his force were removed, but the saboteurs were still in New York. They could no longer affect the election, and were helpless to aid troops in the field, and the broader plan of an army of freed POWs was lost. Yet they decided to continue anyway with the plan to set the city on fire and give the people a scare if nothing else, and let the government at Washington understand that burning homes in the South might find a counterpart in the North. They tried to decide upon a day. They planned for Thanksgiving, but Butler and his troops were still there. Finally, they decided to make the attack on November 25th, which the city celebrated as Evacuation Day, commemorating the day in 1783 when British troops had finally evacuated New York. The agents had been provided with 12 dozen bottles of Greek fire, a chemical concoction that was supposed to ignite when a jar was opened and exposed to air. Headley picked up the bottles in a valise, which he found to be surprisingly heavy and smelled a bit like rotten eggs. Each of the 8 men had taken rooms in 4 hotels, where they would leave behind a satchel with the Greek fire inside. The plan, the New York Times wrote, was to fire the city at a given moment, and a great many different points, each as far remote from the other as possible, except through Broadway, as this thoroughfare they wished to see in a complete blaze from one end to the other. This would presumably overwhelm the fire department. Military History Online writes, "At 17 minutes of 9, the St. James Hotel was discovered to be on fire in one of the rooms. The New York Times reported bedding and furniture had been saturated with an accelerant and set aflame. A few minutes later, Barnum's Museum was ablaze. About the same time, 4 rooms of the St. Nicholas Hotel were ablaze. By 9:20 p.m., a room in Lafarge House was in flames. Then the Metropolitan House, Brandreth House, Frenchie's Hotel, the Belmont House, Wallack's Theater, and several other buildings were on fire." Included in the incendiary maelstrom was Fifth Ward Museum Hotel, Astor House, the Belmont Hotel, the Fifth Avenue Hotel, the Howard Hotel, Lafarge House, Lovejoy's Hotel, the Metropolitan Hotel, the St. James Hotel, the St. Nicholas Hotel, the Tammany Hotel, and the United States Hotel. One of the fires was in the Lafarge Hotel, which was next to the Winter Garden Theater. The alarms briefly disrupted the play, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. The play was an event to raise money to place a statue of William Shakespeare in Central Park. Panic was averted by a brief speech from the lead actor, telling the crowd that there was nothing to worry about. The actor, Edwin Booth, owned the theater, and this was the only performance done by him and his 2 brothers, Junius Jr. and John Wilkes, together. Military History Online reports that Kennedy entered P.T. Barnum's museum, which was packed with patrons, and set fire in a stairwell. A panic ensued, with people rushing out of the building in a stampede, but no one was killed or seriously injured. And again, they had been betrayed, likely by one of the conspirators themselves. The fire department was on alert, and all the fires had been quickly put out with little damage. The Gotham Center for New York History writes, "None of the Confederates had ever visited New York before they arrived to burn it down. They did no scouting to find the most flammable targets. Just days before the attack, one of the Confederates was thrown out of his hotel for loudly proclaiming in his Alabama-born accent the merits of secession. None of the young men had any experience with incendiaries, yet they trusted a stranger to provide them 144 firebombs. And when they took possession of the firebombs, they spent only a few minutes practicing with them, out in the open, in daytime, in Central Park." The New York Times wrote, "The plan was excellently well conceived and evidently prepared with great care, and had it been executed with 1/2 the ability with which it was drawn up, no human power could have saved the city from utter destruction." Despite all their networks and all their plans, the Confederacy gained little return on their $1 million investment to disrupt the Union from Canada. Most of their plans amounted to little, except for one successful plan in which the full involvement of the Confederate Secret Service is still uncertain. That is the April 14th, 1865 assassination of President Lincoln by Edwin Booth's Confederate sympathizing younger brother. As Union troops moved to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, the records of the Confederate Secret Service were destroyed, and we still don't know the full extent of their organization. The fires in New York City didn't cause a lot of damage, but they did cause enough disruption that the raiders were able to escape. All except for Robert Cobb Kennedy, who was captured by federal agents in Detroit as he tried to return to the Confederacy. He was defended in court by a Union general, Edwin Stoughton, with whom he had attended at West Point, but he was convicted of being a Confederate saboteur, sentenced to death. He made one last attempt to escape prison, but he failed this time, and the sentence was carried out on March 25th, 1865. He was the last Confederate soldier to be executed by the United States federal government during the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.